Order. Welcome to this Defence Select Committee hearing on Tuesday the 7th of July 2020. Delighted to welcome General Sir Nick Carter, Chief of the Defence Staff, with responsibility for overall defence, setting overarching strategy for defence, including the future development of the armed forces and the conduct of operations, and leading relationships with other countries and armed forces, all of course subject to the direction by the Secretary of State. Very welcome, General. Really pleased to have you here. You've had a distinguished military career to date. Thank you very much indeed for your service. Delighted that we're able to ask you some questions here today. We will cover some broad themes. You'll be aware that we've got a number of concurrent reviews taking place, not least with COVID-19, procurement, 5G, and then, of course, the integrated review. I know we'll probably cover a lot of those aspects, and thank you for being able to contribute to those particular studies as well. But if I can invite you perhaps to say some opening remarks, and then we'll move forward from there. Thank you.
No, Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to make some opening remarks and to be with you all this afternoon. I think the first thing I'd observe is that even before COVID-19, I would have described the strategic context as being dynamic, complex, with the defining condition being one of instability. It's become a much more competitive playing field, and US foreign policy, which places America first as a binding principle, has of course changed things to one degree or another. But we see a more assertive Russian threat, and we see the challenge of China very vividly. And then there are other players, whether it's Iran or North Korea, who cause us to question what is happening. And of course all of that is overlaid by the threat from terrorism, and radical extremism is not going anywhere, and indeed in places and parts of the world it is growing. And then on top of all of that, the political context of if you like, nationalism and populism has an effect on whether or not one is able to get together the international contributions you need to be able to do something about it. And that's been very striking, I think, during COVID. Now, for us in the military, there's a very important military capability dimension to this, because whilst we've been somewhat fixed in the first couple of decades of this century on the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, counterinsurgency, stabilisation, that sort of stuff, our opponents have thought quite carefully about the sorts of capabilities that might undermine some of our weaknesses and play to their strengths. So we see a significant amount of activity in the sub-underwater surface area in terms of Russia. There's a lot of missile technology that's around now. People have developed cyber and so on and so forth. But what, of course, is interesting about some of this stuff is the extent to which it's been proliferated to their clients. And that means that the freedom of action that we used to be quite sure of is now much harder for us to be certain about in strategic parts of the world. And of course what's also interesting about this is that they practice a form of what I would call authoritarian political warfare. And for them, the strategic landscape is characterised by a continuous and never-ending struggle that encompasses everything from what we would call peace to nuclear war. And that means that one's response to this has to be somewhat different to what we might have done in the past. Hence, I think, this era of constant competition and perhaps arguably constant conflict. Now, I think all of this is about risk management, because nobody wants to breach what we would call the threshold of war. But it is the potential for unwarranted escalation that leads to miscalculation, which we should all watch. And some of the hotspots in the world, whether it's what's happening in Syria or the Eastern Med, and Libya more specifically, could easily become something that escalates beyond control. Now, I think there are some big deductions that we need to draw from this context for our military input to the integrated review. First and foremost, I would say that it needs a strategic response. And if you cast your mind back, and many of the members of the committee will be historians, I'm sure, to 1946, when George Kennan wrote his long telegram, which suggested to the State Department that it would be impossible to live peacefully or in peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. And that, of course, led to the Truman Doctrine, which in due course led to what was a remarkably successful American-led Western strategy throughout the Cold War. And I think that bears thinking about in the context we now find ourselves with the challenge of China and, of course, the assertive threat that is Russia. Next, I think there's a big deduction about allies, because it is allies that, and our relationship with our allies, that for me is our centre of gravity from a military perspective and, of course, from a national perspective as well. And that is something that I think we should reflect long and hard on. And we are very good, on the whole, at building alliances, creating the interoperability that goes with them and working closely with them. Now, I also think, third deduction, that it needs us to take a slightly different view on deterrence, and I would call it modern deterrence. We used to talk in deterrence terms about 4 C's. We talked about comprehension, capability and credibility particularly, and then communication. I think we now need to introduce a 5th one, which I would call competition. Now, that takes us, I think, to the requirement, which we will publish shortly, for a new integrated operating concept, which recognises that you can't distinguish between peace and war when you're up against the sorts of opponents I've described, and that what's actually needed now is to distinguish between your constant activity, which is operating, and what you might have to do if you have to breach the law of armed conflict and go to fighting. So it's more of a continuum. And I think that's quite important, because what it means, of course, is that much of our force structure should be in use much of the time, because that's the way you achieve this competitive deterrent effect that I think you need in the world I've described. I think it's still right, next deduction, to talk about the requirement to mobilise, to modernise and transform defence, and we might come on to that in a bit more detail during questions. I think it's right, as we look towards what our future operating concept might determine, which is a bit of a North Star for how we might look in the 2030s, that we'll need to reflect a bit on what this modernisation looks like, the sorts of technologies that will lead it, but particularly I think we'll have to return to a former era of experimentation, which perhaps harks back to the 1930s, which I think is the last time that we did this systematically. And that experimentation, I think, needs to be conducted very much in conjunction with industry, because generally speaking, that's where most of the technological edge is now found, and how we integrate that in terms of our industrial strategy, how we play it into our modernisation more generally, and the sorts of relationships that that creates, I think, will be pretty vital to us. And that also means, I think, that the amount of effort that we put into R&D in the future needs to be thought hard about, because it is going to be that R&D edge. And we have so much value in this country that we should perhaps be pressing and pushing. Next, I think we need to talk firmly about this idea of transformation, because that's how you do things to the 10x better. And here, of course, it's going to be about digital, because much of the technologies that we need to modernise, as I've described, will be digital technologies. We don't know what the right combination of these digital technologies will be, hence that requirement to experiment. Much about people, and I hope we'll get into that during this discussion, but we have to reform the workforce and place it in the right place for the future. We need to take account of a lot of the very good inputs we've had from people like Marc Francois in terms of how we retain people and indeed where we recruit them from, but we do need to modernise that workforce. And that, I think, takes us very much into the work that one of your former members, Mark Lancaster, is doing at the moment on Reserve Forces 30, which takes Future Reserves 20, which I know Mark will remember from years gone by, to the next level, and how we build on the good work that FR20 set down about the reserve. And we'll probably touch on the reserve a bit, I hope, when we talk about COVID, because the reserve's response to this has been interesting, and I think there are lessons that we should learn for the integrated review. There's much on the acquisition side, and the work that's going on at the moment on a defence security industrial strategy will, I think, be very important as we think about the future, but particularly our relationships with British industry and how that all goes, how that all plays to our modernisation. There's much that should be done on the support side, and there's a big transformation programme involved in that at the moment. And we've learnt quite a lot of interesting lessons about this from COVID and our experience in relation to resilience and supply chains. There's then a bit on the defence medical services. Again, we've learnt a lot from COVID on this, particularly how we integrate our military medics into the NHS, but also how we deliver primary healthcare and secondary healthcare to our people as well. And I think that then takes me back into this people bit, because it's people who are our adaptive edge. And we have got to modernise the skills framework. We've got to make it more friendly for the outside world so that we have a better interaction with the outside world. And indeed, perhaps in certain specialities, begin to encourage lateral movement and lateral entry. And that career structure has got to take more account, I think, of the specialisms these days and of the new things that we require, whether that's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, whether it's defence engagement, and that sort of forward persistence that we're going to have in the global Britain world. But it's equally what we do to improve digital skills and information skills and those sorts of things. And how we manage talent fundamentally has to change, because we've got a generation that's joining the military these days who have a different view on how that talent management should work, and we should accommodate that. And then the last point I'd make in relation to people is we've got much to do on diversity and inclusion. And indeed, the Chiefs of Staff met this morning for 3 hours to discuss our strategy towards defence, towards diversity and inclusion, and what we should do on the back of recent events to stimulate our efforts to do even better, but actually to deliver something importantly. So I think that's how I would set the context at the moment, and what I think will be the key ingredients from our perspective, from the military perspective, into this. And there will be themes there I know you'll want to develop during the course of these questions. Thank you.
Well, Daniel, thank you very much indeed. And can we begin by just thanking all those who are in uniform for what they've done during COVID-19. As you implied, there are some themes which we want to progress and look into. There were a flurry of headlines that came out of the last few days. If we may quickly just deal with those topical matters, and then we'll get into the wider themes. The first was actually just to do with the budget itself. What you display there is not just a passion, but a full understanding of where we are today, a realism of the fact that we are going to need to invest heavily into the future. My question to do with the budget today is, can you manage now with what you're expected to actually do?
I mean, the first point, I think, just for the record, it's worth recording that there is a manifesto commitment to 2% of GDP, whatever GDP may look like this year, but there's equally a commitment to increase defence expenditure at 0.5% annually above inflation. And indeed, last year, the defence budget grew by 2.6% in real terms. Now, as far as I'm concerned, we should live within our means for understandable reasons, but you would never expect any chief of staff not to ask for more. And whoever you turn to, we would always be arguing for more. But the reality, of course, is we live within the means that we have got, and we are satisfied with that at the moment.
I think it's the asking for more which is the important piece, because you spell out, and anybody that actually hears you, that is tuning in today or is aware of what's going on with our defence posture, will be very concerned that there simply isn't enough money to do all the things we have, particularly with the changing character of conflict that you have outlined. My concern, though, is that we don't promote this to the general public. The general public have a very different, perhaps dated view as to what our actual capabilities are, indeed what our size of armed forces is, and indeed what insurance we really do need to deal with the threats, the resilience, everything else that you've spoken about. My question, therefore, is, should the MOD be less shy, less reserved, less risk-averse in actually shouting out about the actual shortfalls? We'll come on to the age of the battle tank, or the limitations of our surface fleet, or indeed the reductions in size of our fast jet capabilities. If the general public were more aware, do you not believe that they'll be more inclined to say, absolutely, that's where that money should go, and the Chancellor would be more conscious too, and therefore we'd get the money to support, rather than, and you touched on GDP, April we saw a reduction in GDP by 20%. And there is a fear that the MOD budget itself might be first hit when it comes to the next budget by the Chancellor.
No, indeed. And of course, that's why this integrated review of foreign security, defence and development is really vital to all of us. Because, of course, that will determine the government's ambition for what it wants defence to do, and that should determine its expenditure. So I think that's where the MOD has a massive role to play, is in making sure that that process genuinely starts with the threat, understands the risks to our country, and then the argument has to play out as that review develops.
Okay. Having a quick question?
Yeah, I mean, the budget is under strain. The NEO report, for example, on the equipment budget clearly demonstrates the problems with it. You've now obviously got some enemies in certain parts of government that want a different emphasis on other different areas. Is not the time, though, now to have a radical look in terms, for example, on the equipment side, where there are some programmes that, frankly, should just be ditched?
I mean, I think that's what we absolutely intend to do during the course of this integrated review. I mean, the bottom line is that what we need consistency in the budget. We would like to have a settlement that is a long-term settlement, because then we can live within our means and take the decisions that have to be taken to achieve that effect. I think the difficulty we've had over the last 3 to 4 years is it's been very hand-to-mouth. We've had to rely on annual settlements to balance the books. And of course that doesn't make for good value for money, it doesn't make for consistency and future-proofing of your plans. So I think we're looking forward to a review that's aligned with the comprehensive spending review, which will give us the chance, we hope, to have a programme that is fixed, that enables that long-term planning, which is critical for the country.
But even with that, the only way that equipment budget is going to come anywhere near balance is if you start taking things out of it. Will we see that? Because I personally haven't looked at it, don't see any other way of it getting to a point where we're putting the resources where we should, and actually being realistic and saying, frankly, that piece of equipment or is a legacy or shouldn't go forward.
General, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought because we're doing a big procurement chunk shortly. We just need to burn through these questions here, and then we'll do procurement in very.
Would very much enjoy answering that in due course if I can.
John, do you just want to ask about the numbers issue that were in the press?
You talked quite a bit about the personnel, and yet we've had a sizable number of reports talking about reductions in all the services, Air Force, Navy, and particularly in the Army, talking about going down to 70,000. Do you think that's sustainable in the same way that, once again, it seems as though they're looking at basically dismantling the Royal Marines or very substantially downgrading the Royal Marines? This will obviously be of great concern to those who are already in those services and those who may come in, and we end up then with a force, frankly, that is below a sustainable number.
There's a bit of deja vu here with the Royal Marines.
The point I'd make is don't believe everything you read in the newspapers.
But I might believe some of it.
Well, none of what you have put on the table in front of me do I recollect ever hearing in a conversation.
The Royal Marines are safe?
The Royal Marines are perfectly safe. I think if you want to talk a little bit about the Royal Marines, and I suspect there's a MP at the top of the screen who might be interested in this particular question. The fact of the matter is that they are some of the finest fighting formation in the world, have a huge regard for what they do. I think there's some interesting stuff that's going on in the moment about their future role, because I think returning them to more of a maritime, true marine profile as part of the future commando idea is a good idea, because that is very threat-informed. And one of the big challenges we have in relation to the threat at the moment is how you get through your opponent's anti-area access denial systems. And the sort of thinking that's going on at the moment with the Royal Marines is the sort of thinking that might give us options for the future. So I'm absolutely delighted that we're modernising it, looking at it like that.
And they've just got a wonderful new uniform as well. So another reason
Indeed.
why you need to let's move on. Kevin, do you want to take us to Fleet Solid Support?
Well, can we go through a checklist then? Because you say you don't recognise that, and it's obviously very welcome what you've said in terms of your commitment to the Royal Marines. But in terms of amphibious capability, one of the suggestions was that's going to be cut. Can you give a commitment that you've just given the Royal Marines about that?
I think it depends what you mean by amphibious capability. And what has to happen is that we need to have a capability that is able to match the threats that we've got today. So I think it's how you use it. But what we're absolutely saying is that there will still be a requirement for literal manoeuvre and the need for that particular skill set in the future.
So in terms of reducing the army down, you'll not be recommending reducing the army down to 50,000?
No, I won't be. No.
Okay. Can I ask in terms of one of the issues which came out actually in last week's NEO report on the carrier strike, and that's around the Fleet Solid Support vessels, which again has been delayed for quite a while, but is obviously a need in terms if we're going to be able to deploy our carriers. Where are we at with it?
The competition was cancelled towards the end of last year, and the reason for that was it didn't represent, none of the solutions that were coming forward represented value for money. So the idea is to recompete it, and the requirement is being written at the moment. And I would guess that the Secretary of State will ask for it to go out to competition relatively soon. I mean, certainly by the end of this calendar year, I'd have thought, although that's not yet confirmed. What does that mean for the carrier deployment? We have sufficient logistics shipping to be able to support IOC of carrier strike in December this year. And importantly, for the carrier's first deployment, operational deployment that is, in 2021, we also have sufficient logistics shipping to be able to support it.
National or international competition?
I don't know. I think much will depend upon how the requirement is written.
But isn't it rather important that one of the great factors in support for defence out in the community is the fact that many communities associate, some of them for military reasons, but a lot because of industry. Isn't it important to maintain that, quite apart from retaining industrial capacity for precisely, if you're going to engage with industry, there has to be an industry to engage with.
Certainly, and I know those will be factors that the Secretary of State will take into account when he issues the competition.
Is the solid support ships, are they warships?
Well, they'll be painted in warship colours, but they're logistic shippings.
That's not my question.
Again, it depends how the requirement is written. Yes, I mean, they're obviously going to be part of a warfighting capability. So
if they're warships, technically warships, they need to be built in the UK.
I think, again, let's see how the requirement gets written.
Okay.
Yes.
On that vague note, moving to the land-based. Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. CDS, good to see you. You said in your remarks we need to mobilise, modernise and transform defence, and I think this committee would probably argue there's no area of that transformation where it's greater required than in procurement. So we looked briefly at the Warrior Capability Sustainment Programme in a hearing a few weeks ago. Can you tell us when will Warrior achieve initial operating capability in the British Army?
So the process that's underway at the moment means that the main gate business case for the next step of it will not be approved until November. So until that has happened and we've had the integrated review, I can't look you in the eye and say precisely when Warrior will have an IOC.
The problem is the programme's been running for over a decade. It's been an unmitigated disaster. It's almost £250 million over budget. And when we inquired about this with the chief executive of Lockheed Martin, who were the prime contractor, over these screens, he was laughing. We saw him on the screens laughing. He thought that was funny. Do you think that's funny?
Good Lord, no. No, I mean, Warrior will be a critical capability for close combat within the British Army.
Okay, but after a decade, we still don't know when it comes into service. So let's try Challenger 2 upgrade.
But I think just to answer the question, I think it goes back to your point about procurement more generally. And of course, what is needed, to my point I made over here, is if you have got a financial settlement over a period of 3 to 5 years, but ideally 5 years,
CDS, we've got
you can then be clear about it.
Sorry, we've got limited time.
Yeah.
With respect, it's nothing to do with the financial settlement. It's to do with the fact that people couldn't take decisions for years. It went round and round in circles. They changed the armament. The thing's been an absolute, to use a phrase you recognise in a different context, a car crash. Challenger 2, running for nearly almost a decade. What's the IOC for the upgraded Challenger?
Again, it's on exactly the same timeline as Warrior. So November is when they will consider the main gate business case for the next step of the programme.
We're told privately it's now December 2025.
I'd not heard that. Not for when the main gate business case is looked at.
Okay, we have.
Well, so what 2025 is that if you don't take action by Christmas time this year, the tank will be obsolete by 25.
Arguably, it's already obsolescent, even though it's got arguably the best crews in the world. It's outmatched by some others. 5.5 years from now, before that new tank enters service, the programme's been going for nearly a decade. AS-90 is obsolescent. We're using FV432 vehicles in the Army, which are over 50 years old. Why is the Army's re-equipment program, you were CGS for a while, why is the Army's land equipment re-equipment program such an unmitigated shambles?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say that if you go back to the 1990s, 80s, 90s, the Army's equipment program was extremely good. What happened then was that Field Marshal Bagnall took a view about what air-land operations should look like, and a whole load of very impressive pieces of equipment entered service. Warrior, Challenger 2, although it was Challenger 1 to begin with, Challenger 2. Yeah. We had Phoenix, you'll recall, the first drone, which was linked to AS-90 and to MLRS. Yeah. The attack helicopter entered service. And all of this was very effectively integrated behind a doctrine. Of course, what's happened since then is that we've had 2 decades of campaigning in theatres like Iraq and Afghanistan, where, of course, the requirement has been very different. And the Army has focused almost all of its attention during those 2 decades on making sure that it did a decent job on counterinsurgency and stabilisation operations.
I accept that, but we withdrew from Afghanistan in 2014. We withdrew 6 years ago. I oversaw part of it. Why 6 years on from Afghanistan is this still a shambles?
It comes down to funding. It comes down to how much money you want to throw at it. I think the requirement is now pretty clear, and that's one of the reasons why Challenger 2 is taking a long time, is because there was this realisation that the programme was not ambitious enough. It needed a smoothbore gun, it needed the ability to put a missile down that barrel to overmatch a Martyr, as you rightly describe. It needed its protection levels to be significantly enhanced. So the requirement has evolved. I think the Army now has a very clear idea of what it needs, The trick now is to find the resources to get behind what they need.
I'll have one more go, because this is a point raised by my colleague, Mr. Jones. I mean, Lockheed, for instance, have performed absolutely appallingly on this, on Warrior. But partly it's also the Army's fault, because time and again it's changed its mind what it wanted. There's been massive indecision on the executive committee of the Army board. You know, one minute we wanted light, flexible forces that could fly halfway around the world and intervene. Then we want heavy armour that can take on the Russians. Then we want something else. And the equipment programme has kind of has oscillated backwards and forwards between those different poles. So can you give the committee any, because we may want to look at this more closely, can you give the committee any assurance while you're here that this nonsense is going to stop? We're going to take some decisions and stick to them, because it would be nice.
I think for the last 5 years there's been absolute clarity on what the Army wanted by way of its heavy armour capability, Warrior and Challenger 2.
Why is it still years away?
Absolute clarity on what it wanted for the strike capability, which is a combination of Ajax and Boxer, which was announced earlier this year.
If there's absolute clarity, when will Warrior enter service?
It comes down to funding.
What about the legacy vehicles from Afghanistan and Iraq that we've got? I mean, where do
It's
they
a question of how you see the world in the future. I mean, if you think it is inconceivable that there will be a stabilisation operation somewhere around the world, then those capabilities can be pushed to one side. The question, of course, is whether you hedge for a stabilisation operation in the future and whether you feel you need platforms that are counter-IED-based platforms. And there's a judgment that needs to be made during the course of this integrated review as to whether you want to keep spending money on keeping them going or whether you don't.
Just to wrap this one up, there is a general concern by this committee, but we've seen this longevity here, of the changing of the spec during the procurement cycle itself. Not only that, but it's compounded by the fact that the very people, the military personnel that are assigned to that task, then rotate out as well, so that expertise is then lost. That's been a criticism too. The Centurion by Tankies is pointed to as one of the best tanks, Second World War tank, because of its modularity, its ability to upgrade during its actually life cycle. You mentioned the smoothbore barrel. We understand that it was the arguments to the way it should be rifled or smoothbore that delayed itself. So I think the message is please can we... If we really is to make sure that the kit is simpler, more modular, so it can be upgraded rather than waiting for the utopian prize, which is often over the hill.
If I may, I think the other ingredient to this, which is worth reflecting on, is if there was a land defence industrial strategy, that would be very helpful. And what I think needs to happen is that we need to think through really hard about how we are going to do something in partnership with industry over a period of 15 to 20 years, whereby you can build innovation and spiral development into the piece of equipment. So at the end of it, it remains current and you don't have this awful cliff edge of an out-of-service date and obsolescence.
Okay, thank you for that. We're now going to move to the enduring current emergency, COVID-19, and the military's response to it. Martin Doherty-Hughes, do you want to take us forward?
Thank you, Chair. And Nick, can I say it's actually really good to hear a member of the senior chain of command voicing support for multi-year budgetary requirements, something which I've been slightly vocal about in this committee. So it's good to hear that. In terms of planning and preparations for a pandemic, can you maybe tell us what the ministry did in terms of undertaking preparations and planning within departments and in conjunction with the department itself and in conjunction with the government?
So we have a set of contingency plans, particularly for a flu pandemic, which we obviously pulled off the shelf when this occurred. But of course, as we know, it turned out to be really rather more severe than the flu pandemic that we'd planned for, and indeed that government more generally had planned for. What we were able to do, though, very quickly, because we do exercise it on an annual basis, is to put into place our Standing Joint Command UK, which is the 3-star Lieutenant General level command headquarters we have in Aldershot, which sits over the top of all of the regional headquarters that we have throughout the United Kingdom and in the devolved administrations as well. And that is routinely exercised. It has a number of liaison officers that work with it, so that when you need to turn into the LRF, the local regional fora level, and indeed the level below that, most of the relationships have already been created and exercised, and you're able to switch on what you need to switch on in order to be able to get a genuinely joined up or holistic approach, both at regional level and at national level. So that was something that was relatively straightforward for us just to mobilise it. I think the big change that happened this time round, which I thought was a great success, was the Secretary of State agreeing very positively to delegate many of the authorities that were necessary down to local level for local commanders to make judgments about what was the necessary support they should give to other government departments. And of course that made the process much more agile than it had ever been before. And I think that local commanders found that hugely helpful. And that notion of delegation, decentralisation and the responsiveness that comes with it, I think is one of the big lessons that we learned from the whole process.
Okay, well, that's good to hear, because I know, at least from my perspective, devolution time for that type of decision to be made. So that's good to hear, and I'm sure it's reflected in other departments across the rest of the UK. In terms of the full use of MOD capabilities such as strategic planning, command and control, could you maybe tell us, was defence brought into the response early enough? Could you have done things earlier within the ministry? Could you have been brought in earlier in terms of the pandemic planning?
I think we were brought in a timely fashion, and I think we saw that particularly with the operations that were mounted to build and create those Nightingales, which happened relatively quickly, I would say. I think the same applied to the support that we provided to Skipton House and the NHS England's strategic headquarters, where we were very quickly asked to come in and help with the PPE challenge, particularly the distribution networks and everything associated with it. But then eventually when the defence equipment and support were brought in to help on the make and buy side, I think that was impressive. I think this was an emergency like no other emergency any of us have had to deal with before. And I think inevitably there was a requirement perhaps for people to educate each other on what everybody did. You know, I personally didn't have a clue what DHSC did beforehand, and I didn't have much of a clue about the NHS. I now would like to think I've got rather a good understanding and knowledge of that, and that's the same for all of our people who've been involved in that. But equally, I think that those other government departments needed to learn a bit about what we could do. So there was obviously a learning process, and I think what we perhaps learned from all of this rather more strategically is that I wouldn't describe COVID as a black swan, but there will be black swans in the future. And therefore, thinking about these things in advance and genuinely exercising them and doing the sort of thing that we like doing a lot, what I would call a sort of war game, is a good idea, because that, of course, gets people thinking about each other's capabilities, and you can learn about each other and what each other can contribute across an integrated approach.
And just, would you think there's an ongoing role for the armed forces in the pandemic at the moment?
No, absolutely.
Maybe you would also agree with me that there are also many members of the reserves who, while not on active duty, are frontline workers in the NHS. They're already doing other jobs outside the armed forces structure, which has not really been reflected in some of the discussion and debate over recent weeks.
No, and I think you allude to an important point. I mean, just over 14,000 members of the armed forces have been either directly involved or very closely in support of the government's response to it. And it has touched a whole range of different people, whether it's reservists or those on full-time service, or indeed people from the Engineer and Logistics Staff Corps, which is quite an unusual organisation, which people, I know this committee will have heard of. And I think that, what they have done, even if they are NHS employees, where they've obviously been recognised, does deserve great recognition. But what I'm most proud of in terms of our response is that our involvement has not been one that has been sort of proudly strutted as the front line. I think it's the fact that we've exercised a degree of humility in supporting others on the front line, and that's been the culture that has been prevalent, I think, with all those in the armed forces who've been involved in this, and I think that's been something I've certainly been rather proud of.
Thank you. And I wonder just finally, Chair, if I could ask a question about something which is just being made public knowledge in the last half hour. And Jen, you'll forgive me, it would be remiss of me not to take the opportunity that there's a publication coming out today about Saudi Arabian-led coalition received possible UK training for naval tactics to blockade Yemen, which would be described as unlawful under the UN. Would you like to say anything about that at the moment?
No, I wasn't aware of what you've just announced, I'm afraid.
Well, it's just been announced through a Freedom of Information request, so maybe that's something the committee and the General maybe take away, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah, did you have a question on this point?
No, Chair. Thank you.
Can I just ask then, you actually illustrate the versatility of the armed forces, the ability to see a challenge and rise to that challenge. And because you are have the best strategists, you are trained for emergency response, my concern is that you weren't utilised perhaps as best as you could be. There is a difference, as you're aware, between policy creation and indeed the delivery of the operation itself. And what we see this government actually not changing the dynamic, the construct, if you like, in response to this enduring emergency. It decided to use its peacetime cabinet-led government to respond. Do you believe that, I put this in a glass half full way, that perhaps there's more that the armed forces could do to help in the operational delivery, in addition to what they've already done?
I mean, I think it's always a fine judgment, and ultimately, I guess, it will always be a political judgment as to how you use the armed forces in support of the civil authorities. And I think, going back to my point about our role has been, I think, quietly understated, but nonetheless very decisive and helpful in certain areas. I think that's a good thing. I think if there were uniforms everywhere, I think that might have been quite unsettling for people. So to my view, it was done in a nuanced way, and I think that that's actually probably the right answer in this particular set of circumstances.
Actually referring to the cabinet, so inside the decision making, that once decisions have been made, how then do you do the operational delivery? How do you make sure that you then have the best strategists working out how to actually expedite decision making?
Well, certainly at the sort of level, the operational level, which I would call sort of NHS England headquarters level, I think that our input there in the way that they developed their plans was very effective. And I think a combination of that and some intelligent management consultants and the bringing together of two interesting cultures. I mean, the NHS is a professional culture alongside our professional culture. I think those two cultures complemented each other rather well. And actually, I think, the plans that were drawn up for how PPE was ultimately distributed were a pretty good example of operational level plans that, did something really challenging. And I think, you'll recall when I did a Downing Street briefing, I said that this is difficult stuff. And indeed, I said it was our hardest logistic challenge I'd ever seen in 40 years of service. And I think that was pretty well done, looking back on it.
Can I just, it seems a very trivial question, but I think it's actually important given the types of communication and the information war perhaps we're at. You have a computer-generated operations name system, and they are very unimaginative. Operation Rescript, I think, is the domestic approach response to COVID-19. Operation Broadshare. Could I not suggest it would be far more invigorating for all personnel to be participating in a grand Operation Nightingale or Operation Sotaria, for example? I think she was the Greek goddess of safety. Or maybe Operation Carter. That would really inspire characters to make sure they did their best. I just think there's something a bit more motivational. It's very, very bland, very dry.
I mean, actually, I think you raise a very interesting point. I mean, one of the things that I think will increasingly change, going back to what I described as the new operating environment, is that very rarely now is an exercise simply an exercise. An exercise now in many ways is an operation because, of course, you're trying to have an impact with that operation in information warfare terms. And I do agree with you. I think how we describe our contribution can have an information effect. So I think it's certainly one of those things we should take away and show an interest in.
I look forward to the first non-computer generated name with interest.
And it'll be Operation Elwood.
Let's move to the integrated review, which has been stop-start. Derek Twigg, do you want to take us forward on this one?
Thank you, Chair. General, can I ask what work the Armed Forces did to prepare for the integrated review, and how will you ensure now it's restarted that your voice is heard at the top table?
We've got perhaps a comms issue there. It's to do with the preparation. What have you done so far in preparation to the integrated review? Maybe you can just explain as well as to where we are, because it was postponed. Are you at it now? When will it report?
Yes, the work is well underway now, and it was relaunched 2 or 3 weeks ago. And in terms of what we did in preparation for it, that really started when our expectation of this review occurred in about this time last year. We certainly started work with vengeance in the autumn. And it started with us wanting to get this integrated operating concept that I described earlier banked and agreed amongst the Chief of Staff. because that provided essentially the baseline against which we felt we needed to develop our thinking. The next aspect of this was that we developed a future operating capability, or concept, I beg your pardon, which is the North Star that I referred to earlier, which will provide us with a path towards the way that we think we should fight in the 2030s. And that really was very much about the sort of digital technologies that will change things. And as part of that, we coined the expression sunset and sunrise capabilities. And I'll just give you an illustration of what we feel sunrise capabilities are likely to be for the 2030s. We think that they will be smaller and faster because it's going to essentially be about a competition for hiding versus finding. There'll be much about low observable and stealth technologies. Electronic warfare and passive deception will be there. We will trade probably reduced physical protection for increased mobility. Question about warrior, of course, is interesting in that. They will include a mix of manned, unmanned and autonomous platforms. They will be integrated into ever more sophisticated networks. They will have open systems architectures that enable the rapid incorporation of new capability and the rapid integration into the network. We anticipate them being much less dependent on fossil fuels for obvious reasons. And we think they will employ many more non-line of sight fires. And here one's, of course, talking about long-range missile technology. So that's a sort of gives you a sense of the sort of thing that you'd find in that future operating concept, and the sort of thing against which you might judge, to your original question, the sorts of capabilities you might take out of the programme now and that you might want to have in the programme in the future if you're serious about fighting and winning. What we then did was to bring the Chiefs of Staff together and to get them to have a conversation based upon a sort of food for thought short paper on how we'll fight. And then the Chiefs of Staff were asked to go away and think about how each of their domains, and here I'm talking about the new domains of space, cyber, maritime, air and land, how those domains would integrate into this broader concept of how we would fight in the future. So that gave them a chance to think about what their own operating concepts for their domains would look like. And we are now in the process of bringing their ideas into a common idea so that we've got a sense in terms of the broad requirement how we would want to fight in the 2030s. Because, of course, when you're talking about the period of this integrated review, it's 2030 onwards. So we will be positing a integrated force as distinct from a joint force for 2030.
Thank you. Derek, do you have a follow-up? Yes,
can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, sir.
Can I just go back to some of the earlier comments about funding and personnel and ask you about, are you happy that you've got enough people of the calibre for special forces coming through?
Straight answer is yes.
Because your gene pool of special forces is taken from the wider Armed Forces fraternity. So you're confident you have that capability? Yes. Okay. Derek, anything else?
That's fine, thank you.
Good. Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. General, very good to see you again. As I said earlier, it's great to see how your career's progressed. You've talked, I look back to the conflicts we were involved in together, like the Balkans, and then you talk about the 2030s and sunrise capability. It's good to see how we're preparing for the evolution of the battle space. But what I'd be keen to understand is how our armed forces are going to contribute to the threat and risk assessment carried out as part of the integrated review.
No, thank you for the question and thank you for the compliment. I'm just trying to make sure that this isn't a career-ending moment, Stuart, to your point. But no, in terms of how we're contributing to that threat and risk assessment, we have, as I think you probably know, a very accomplished organisation based in Shrivenham called our Doctrine and Concepts Development Centre, who produce a document called Global Strategic Trends. And the period of time that the Global Strategic Trends tends to cover is handily enough in the sort of time frame beginning of that the integrated review is involved in. So they've been very much involved in the process, and their input has been very helpful. And then, of course, we also have a brigadier, a Royal Marine brigadier, on the team that's doing the work. And he is able to reach into the Chief of Defence Intelligence area, and he's also obviously able to reach out to DCDC, but also to military allies and so on and so forth. So we feel reasonably confident that our perspective on the threat and the risks associated with that threat are properly represented. The judgment then, of course, is how it gets played by government into the broader review, and that's where, of course, we slightly lose control of what's happening.
Could I ask you to expand on how important you think that contribution is to the integrated review?
Well, I mean, I think that it's absolutely vital that we start with the threat, because if you don't do a proper analysis of the threat, you'll get into a muddle. And one of the things that I've often argued for is the ability to do what I would call net assessment, because there's always a risk that you look at the threat today, and actually, given the sort of longevity of the defence programme and all that goes with it, and the length of time that it takes to bring some of the more sophisticated capabilities into service, you need to be looking ahead by epoch. So you need to look at what it's going to be like in 5 years' time, what it's going to be looking in 10 years' time, and then beyond. And when you do that, you're looking at how your opponent's capabilities will have evolved in the same period of time, or your potential opponent's capabilities, and then you match them to what your programme is going to deliver. And you're forever doing this judgment between their perspective and your perspective to make sure that there are no gaps that are developing, or if there are gaps, you've got a mechanism for filling them. So how we play net assessment into this is a really important set of questions. And I think when you get experts in the room and you talk to them about the threat, I would very much encourage you to ask them about the future and not just today, and to ask them about this process of net assessment so that you do make these judgments about relative capabilities over time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed. Richard Drax, did you just want to touch on alliances at this point, just with NATO and particularly US footprint in Europe?
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. General, very nice to see you. I think the last time I saw you was in Scotland. That was a few years ago, and I remember talking about your promotion even then. So many congratulations to where you've got to now. With the United States pulling troops out of Europe, and I've had it reported to me at a recent strategic mobilization war game, the European NATO countries apparently offered medical and support service, but no frontline elements. And the Americans' view was that, right, we die and then you patch us up. Can you just assure me, or reassure me perhaps, that with your work with NATO and particularly the United States, that they're not heading off in a direction NATO as the key of our defence for the future?
Well, obviously, speaking entirely from a military perspective, the relationships that I have with my US opposite number, Mark Milley, who's an old friend, he, when he was head of their army before he became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I worked very closely together on how we would interoperate within the NATO concept inside Europe. And at no time has he given me any indication that his leadership are going to change the way in which they would contribute to what we do in Europe. In all sectors, in all domains, whether it's maritime, air or land, or for that matter, cyber or space. So now I'm entirely confident from a military perspective that my military interlocutors are committed to the alliance, and they are committed to delivering the sort of effect that we grew up with when we were both subalterns in Western Germany, you up in Hona or Fallingbossel and me down in Celle.
What about our European allies, General? They don't seem to be quite so firm, do they? They're a bit more wobbly, I think. It's fair to say, don't you agree?
Yes, although I think, one's seen some very positive indications of the sort of money that the Germans want to commit to defence, looking good. And certainly we have a very close relationship in combat terms with the French, who we've operated with closely in the past. And when I look at our joint expeditionary force, which, as you know, is the alliance that we've created within NATO, but outside NATO as well, between the Baltics, the Norway's, Finland, Sweden and Denmark, and of course also the Netherlands, what I see there is a fighting spirit and indeed a desire to develop the sort of combat capabilities that will be necessary to provide deterrence and reassurance looking forward.
And General, would you agree that we've got to be, the United States is going to be our main ally, always has been and probably always will be. it's unlikely we'll operate ever on our own. We simply don't have the numbers to do that. So in essence, if we do something or are asked to do something or join the United States, we're going to have to ensure that all our kit is fully integrated with theirs. Is it?
I agree with you, first of all, that it is a reasonable assumption that we will never fight without allies. I also agree with you that we're most likely to fight within a NATO context. And indeed, I would also agree that our most likely partner will be the United States. Now, I can assure you that we exercise in all domains annually with Americans. We have a number of interoperability initiatives because, of course, you need to look at interoperability in a number of ways. Part of it is about your doctrine and your concepts, which are ourselves and the Americans always aligned on. Secondly, it's about the human capability, and we have a significant footprint in the United States, as do they in our military over here. And indeed, we now have a deputy corps commander and 2 deputy divisional commanders in the US Army, for example. Indeed, we are about to deploy our carrier group in 2021 with US Marine Corps F-35s on board with our own F-35s. And that is a level of interoperability that I think it's rare any country ever achieves. So to my mind, we're in a good place. Technology is key to this as well. And of course, that's where one has to break through some of the industrial dynamics in this. But our goal is always to try and make sure that we are technology integrated as well as the human and doctrinal side as well.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Before we turn to Mark and more questions on procurement, I just wanted to focus just for a second on these global strategic trends that you spoke about. My first question is the good work that you're doing on the integrated view, how is it possible to advance too far without firstly understanding the foreign policy baseline, which, forgive me, I don't think you've actually received yet. We haven't actually had that study that says what our place is, what our vision is, what Britain's role, what our ambitions are in this changing world.
Yes, I mean, I think it's an iterative process, and we spend much of our time talking to those who are designing and developing the foreign policy at the moment. So John Bew, for example, who you'd have come across in number 10, and Alex Ellis, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor, who's responsible for the review. And of course, what we're doing is we're iterating. And I think we're also working on the assumption, going back to my point about the importance of our integrated operating concept, which sees the need to compete, that we would expect the armed forces to be being used and being used in a forward presence and forward deployed type way. Okay. So the sorts of activities that you might see with capacity building in Nigeria or whatever it might be that I think you'll remember from your days as a minister are exactly the sorts of things that we would expect to provide capabilities that government will be able to use if they pursue that type of agenda.
The big elephant in the room, if you're talking about constant political competition, is China. And I think the reason why this committee would be keen to see the integrated review take place as quickly as possible is because we are seeing a change in power shift from the west to the east. Perhaps COVID-19 has actually exposed limitations of the world's architecture in the ability to challenge, but also the weaknesses of collective responsibility in standing up to any aggression. But it's also shown and exposed a more assertive, more dominant China, not least in what we're seeing in Hong Kong, but also the way it treats its own people, its expansion into the South China Sea, and what it is doing to entrap countries through its infrastructure programs. This is the sort of power competition I think that you're referring to in your opening remarks. Should Britain be learning more about China, understanding it better, and preparing for to perhaps insulate ourselves or indeed work with our allies on what will be a growing challenge to the way West does business?
And straight answer is yes, I think we should. I mean, I think what we're describing here is the requirement for a strategic response. And it was when I talked, I think, about George Kennan earlier in my opening remarks and how that prompted the Truman Doctrine. And it seems to me that it's a strategic response that's going to have to integrate all of the instruments of statecraft, whether it's ideology, diplomacy, finance, trade policy, and, of course, military power. And I think in doing that, it's very important, and I would say this as a military officer, that we remember our Clausewitz. And you'll recall that Clausewitz said, the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish by that test the kind of contest, he used the word war, but I'll use the word contest, the kind of contest on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. And I think we need that clarity of purpose as a starter for 10. And with that clarity of purpose, I think it'll be very possible for us to help catalyse a strategy that our allies will be able to execute alongside us.
Can I just ask, you mentioned 2 political advisors. I know John very well, but a very good author of Citizen Clem. But who is politically in charge of this in terms of, because I know when we did the review back in 98, which John was involved in as a minister, there was a lead minister in charge of it. Is there a lead minister in charge of this review, or is there a cabinet subcommittee doing it?
My understanding is that the First Secretary is in charge of it at the moment, but what will happen, I suspect, when we get the new NSA is that he might well take it over. Because you'd expect that to be the sort of focus for it, I'd have thought.
Wait a minute, you just said you believe that's the case.
Well, I mean, I think, people are in transition at the moment, so I don't think it's that clear.
Well, no,
but certainly what we do know at the moment is that the First Secretary is leading the process on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Okay. Can I just
quickly... Is there a cabinet subcommittee on this? Or?
I think we could probably get back to you and confirm precisely what it looks like.
Okay, can I just turn back to China, if I may?
Can I just finish what I'm saying? Because it's quite concerning, especially after the things that you didn't recognise over the weekend, that, things are being said that are obviously destabilising to the members of the armed forces by people who are not elected. And I think from your point of view, having clarity in terms of political cover is important, and it's a bit concerning if there doesn't seem to be a clear process of how, one, political oversight, if that's going to happen initially, but also how then it's going to be, which you'll know what will happen, there'll be jockeying for positions between different departments when the ultimate paper is actually produced.
Well, the ultimate purpose of the National Security Council, chaired by the Prime Minister, is to absolutely guide and sit over this enterprise. And as you know, the NSC is a subcommittee of the Cabinet. So I think in overarching political terms, that would be the way in which one would see this thing being delivered.
Not at the moment.
Well, the NSC has considered it. And as a member of the NSC, I've sat alongside and taken part in the debate. So the answer is the NSC is engaged in it. The question is when you get into the level of detail below that and how that happens. And of course, the review has only just been kick-started. So I think precisely what that looks like is probably slightly different.
Okay, thank you for that. I just want to finish off on China and then move on to procurement, because I want to focus on what, if anything, new is happening in the MOD to understand the changing competition, if I can put it fairly, from China itself, because it's growing its military capability. 20 years ago, it was on par with the UK. Now it's 5 times larger than us. It's overtaken Russia, and it's on par, I think, to have parity with the United States, probably in our lifetimes. It's clearly more aggressive. It's not transparent. It doesn't follow international rules and norms. What is Britain's position? How should we deal with what is a changing attitude, I think, across the nation towards China, and being more concerned than, let's say, we were 10 years ago, when there was hope, a desire to perhaps see China mature into a responsible international stakeholder?
Well, I mean, speaking, as the head of the armed forces, any military response that one make towards China can only be done with allies. And I think how we create the alliances and the military structures to be able to deal with it if it becomes a threat is what I would recommend. But at the moment, I think it is premature to describe it as a threat. It is a challenge, and we should recognise that as we adopt our strategic approach, which I recommended about 2 questions ago.
Okay, there are reports in allegations that China is seeking to influence elite figures in our military, in our politics, in our business, in our academia, to support its goals and to influence, using a soft power capability. Would that be something that concerns you?
Well, they haven't come to me yet.
Okay, well, that's good to know. You're still on side. That's the nation will breathe the sigh of relief. But we are seeing an advancement, if you like, in the changing character of conflict. It's less about territory now. It's more about digital. It's more about influence. It's more about who you can actually have power over.
Yes, I mean, I've talked a lot in various speeches in this role about how the character of conflict has evolved. And you're exactly right. What has happened now, given the rapid pace of technology, but particularly the information environment, is a whole new range of tactics, techniques and tools are now available to those who might wish to make mischief. And that's particularly the case in the information domain, where I think it's much easier for people to be coercive. But it's all more nuanced than that. And one needs to recognise that it's getting key appointments in UN committees. It's how you leverage resources. It's how you end up creating clients that may not be allies, but they're perhaps
So China now has 4
indebted.
of the top 15 agency slots versus the United States, which only has 1, for example. Is that an illustration of what you're talking about?
I think it is competitive. And ultimately what you need to do is to work out which of these things you're going to compete for and which really matter to you.
Let's take us back to more domestic matters. Mark, do you want to take us to the equipment plan?
Thank you, Chairman. General, you mentioned Clausewitz and whether you're studying him at Sandhurst or at RCDS. He obviously had a famous concept of the fog of war. And there seems to be an extremely deep and impenetrable fog above Abbey Wood, where allegedly we organise our procurement. The NAO report, which my colleague mentioned earlier, looked into the entire area of equipment capability and concluded that of 32 major programmes that they forensically investigated, they are after all our national auditor, only 5 of them, 5, were due to be delivered on time. As the professional head of the armed forces, what is your view on that?
Well, clearly, it's disappointing that you don't make the timelines that you need to make for all sorts of reasons that you would understand. But I do think one needs to recognise that often you're dealing with very rapid evolving requirements which have an impact upon things. But importantly, you're also dealing, as we have done for certainly the last 5 years, with a very dynamic financial situation. And that's why I think it's extremely important that the integrated review and in parallel the comprehensive spending review deliver a multi-year settlement to the defence.
I don't think this...
No, it is really important, this. Please let me finish. Yeah. The reason it is so important is that then gives you planning consistency. Because one of the reasons that programmes get delayed is because you have to take savings in year and you have to keep deferring things. And if you keep deferring things, then you inevitably end up with them not making the timelines that you want. If you've got a defence programme you can rely on that has got a consistent set of funding over a consistent period of time, then you are able to make the sorts of judgments you need to bring things in on time. And one of the challenges we have is this constant process of annuality, which causes you to have to keep taking savings and keep deferring things.
I completely agree. Yeah. But another fundamental challenge is the inability of the department to manage the contractors. So often, many of these programmes go over budget, and because of that, you have to endlessly keep rejuggling the programme. Only 5 delivered on time, many of them over budget. I mean, I could reel them off. Warrior CSP, MFTS, Astute, Trident Infrastructure, Crow's Nest. I mean, they just go on and on and on. This committee is conducting a major inquiry into procurement, which hopefully will be complete in time to inform the integrated review. There have been 13 previous reviews into procurement, and yet nothing ever seems to change. The programmes still run late, they still go over budget, everybody gets promoted, no one gets sacked, billions are wasted, the armed forces go without the kit they need, and yet nothing ever seems to change. We've had a number of witnesses in the context of that inquiry who've admitted that the system is broken or near broken. Is that your view?
I think there's a great deal that can always be done to improve it. Mm-hmm. But I imagine during the course of your procurement inquiry, you will ask the Chief Executive of the Defence Equipment and Support to come and give evidence, Sir Simon Bolam. And I think what he will do when he gives you evidence is to give you some reassurance that his organisation is transforming itself.
You couldn't be further from the truth. As you've mentioned him, I wasn't going to, but as you've put him in play, he's been before this committee twice before in recent years. he couldn't even answer the most basic questions about his responsibilities. He couldn't even understand the effect of exchange rates on balancing the equipment plan, particularly the pound-dollar exchange rate, because as we increasingly buy off the shelf from the US, for which there may be good operational reasons, obviously the pound-dollar exchange rate becomes more fundamental in balancing the equipment plan, which is still out of bounds. When the committee challenged him on this, his reply was, I paraphrased, you could read the transcript, this is nothing to do with me. I mean, to be honest, his performance was laughable. But he's not here today, you are. This review is an opportunity once and for all to grasp the nettle, and there's no point having an integrated review if it doesn't address the failure of the procurement system. Because we're an all-party committee, sir, and we might not agree with you on everything, but I think we would agree with you that we'd all like to see more resources devoted to defence, particularly with a rising China for all the reasons the chairman has articulated. But it's very difficult to make that argument with conviction when the first thing the Treasury say is there's no point giving them any more money. They can't even spend what we give them properly. They're like it's like pest apparel. It's like a kid in a sweet shop. All they ever do is argue for more money, and when we give it to them, they pee half of it up the wall. Are we finally going to change it, or are we just going to go around in more and more circles with nothing ever getting improved? Surely this is our opportunity to finally do something about it.
And you were a minister before, so you, I know, have a close, intimate knowledge of it from when you were Minister of Armed Forces. Yeah. The fact of the matter is that one of our...
They never let me do procurement. I had too strong views on it. So...
Anyway, we have a number of things that are underway at the moment. There's a Defence, Security and Industrial Strategy Review, which will have a significant impact upon procurement, because what it should do is it should set the way in which we want to engage industry. And of course there are lots of parallel factors associated with that, which will play precisely to the question you want to answer. And that will be vital to us. Not least because I think it will recommend that we need to have a slightly different relationship with certain parts of industry. And that relationship should be less of a gladiatorial, competitive relationship, and one that is more collaborative, perhaps to a degree, for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because it allows you perhaps to build innovation into what you acquire, and that is important to us. What it also does is perhaps to provide some confidence in terms of the timelines in which things will be delivered, and particularly in terms of the timelines over which you will then end up addressing any obsolescence that might come into it, but also in terms of how you work together to deliver a different outcome. So I think that's really important. The second aspect that I think is interesting is what has been done as part of our acquisition review at the moment, which has definitely taken several programmes and worked out how they can be delivered at pace. Now, one of the things which we have, I absolutely acknowledge, got to do is we've got to improve, within the military career structure particularly, our ability to be able to hold industry to account. Because increasingly, we need to have the sort of skills that are recognised in programming and project management. And that is not something that we are particularly gifted at, and we need to improve. Secondly, we need to improve our commercial skills. You know, and when you join the military as a warfighter, you don't necessarily realise that you're going to end up having to be involved in the way that you and I are now having this conversation. Yeah. And we have got to do something about developing the career structure and specialising people who become much more competent at being able to hold industry to account for what they need to deliver, but also understanding the possibilities that can be drawn from industry in exchange. And we have work to do on that. We particularly have work to do on what I would call contract management. And you see that particularly in things like facilities management, where, of course, you know, the average quartermaster is not necessarily that well gifted in holding an industry contractor to account. And if that happens, it's always the god of extras that end up pulling the floor from your affordability position, or indeed from the service that you get for the soldier or the sailor or the airman and airwoman.
Well, you made the good point earlier that, you know, we don't have a land system strategy, which I think the committee have picked up on. We do have a naval strategy. We do have a sort of an air strategy, a la Tempest and all of that, and we don't in land. And that, I think, something where you're right and we want to look at in more detail. I don't want to overrun my time, but I just want to put two other questions to you quickly. Firstly, given that this has been such a mess for many years, and given that we want to see more resources for defence, we are actually trying to help, believe it or not. And I think what the hint we're trying to drop is unless you reform yourselves very quickly, someone's going to do the reforming for you, and it might be easier to do it yourselves.
No, I absolutely don't disagree with that. What I would say, and you might think, what in the earth is he raising this for, is that the defence equipment and support area is often given a poor vote in terms of its reputation. This is an organisation which mobilised remarkably for the COVID response. And Friday a week ago, they passed their 10 billionth procurement of individual items of PPE. And they had spent £5 billion in doing that for the government. Now, there's no other organ of government that was able to do that. And they stepped up to the plate to do that at extraordinarily short notice. So I think before we run them down, we should acknowledge that they have contributed massively to the nation's challenge over the course of the last 4 or 5 months.
I'll accept that. I'm not knocking them for COVID. I am knocking them for procuring military equipment. At the end of the day, as we both know, the role of the armed forces is to contribute to deterrence. But if deterrence fails, to fight and to win, to protect our freedom. You can't deter if lots of your equipment is old, tired, rusty and obsolescent, because the procurement programmes to replace them are way over budget and years late. My final word on the subject is this. 13 reviews, decades of failure. 1986, Michael Heseltine and Peter Levine produced a report called Learning from Experience after the Nimrod debacle that cost us £1 billion of taxpayers' money, and we had to buy AWACS instead. That was 1986. Could we just make a plea to you? You are the professional head of the armed forces. Please nip back to the department and ask them to sort their bloody selves out, because if not, Cummings is going to come down there and sort you out his own way, and you won't like it.
Okay, I think that message is passed on. Looking back at the SDSR 2015, which I think is a good landmark document to take stock of, and whether that was implemented. And I understand it ran into the buffers as soon as the spending review came up. Promises were made in this document which couldn't be fulfilled. And I think that plays into Mark's point there, is that I think that the MOD needs to be clearer that if it agrees, or if government agrees to the next SDSR, this integrated review, absolutely, there must come the funding to support every single project that's in there. Because clearly aircraft carriers in 2015, without increasing the naval budget, is going to have an impact on the rest of the naval flotilla. And that's exactly what's happened.
Yes, and I've made the point a couple of times today. If you have a multi-year settlement, and you therefore have the confidence to plan on a multi-year basis, it's extraordinary how much easier it is to manage procurement.
Right. Is there a country that does exactly that we can learn from? No.
The United States has a process of quadrennial review.
But that's still done on a 4-year sort of cycle, and then you again start from scratch.
Yeah, but they're looking forward.
Talking about each one of those is over 10 years, I think. Most
their project managers often stay for at least 5 years, don't they?
That perhaps is the difference.
And I think continuity is important in all of this.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move to, if we can, thank you. I'm now going to move to those other aspects away from the conventional, so maritime, air and land, to Richard Drax, who's just going to take a look at these new dimensions of war fighting. Richard.
Thank you, Chairman. General, the nature of warfare, as you've hinted, you've said this afternoon, is changing. We all know that. And new weapons innovation is going to change the way future wars are fought, if indeed, let's hope they're not. Would you say that our conventional forces, now circa 72,000, is the minimum to which you'd be prepared to go? Are there any new equipment, cyber, drones, and anything else innovative that is brought forward to fight future wars, would be in addition to and not at the detriment of the existing number of men and women who serve this country with such distinction?
I hope you don't mind me being a slight pedant to begin with, because the first observation I'd make is that it's the character of warfare that's changing, not the nature of war. The nature of war is always violent, visceral, it's about politics. It's the character that's changing. Second observation I'd make is that, of course, our conventional forces are much larger than 72,000 because, of course, you need to bring the regular components of the Air Force and the Navy into that equation as well. So it takes it up to a figure well over 100,000. The answer is that...
I'm talking about the Army. I'm talking about the Army, General.
Oh, okay. The answer is that I think if you're looking forward 10 or 15 years, and you'll recall my answer that provoked the conversation about sunrise capabilities, what we don't yet know is what automation will do for us. We don't yet know whether robots are going to have an impact. It is already possible, as we all know, that you can link up 9 logistic trucks to one real driver. Now, that would have a significant impact upon how you delivered your output and your capability. So I don't think we shouldn't ignore what technology might do for us. What I would give you assurance on is that, to my mind, for the next 10 to 15 years, the ability to generate mass in order to overwhelm people on a battlefield will still be a very, very important ingredient in future warfare.
General, the technology to which you refer, of course, is great while it works. But presumably our enemies are trying to find ways of countering that technology. If the technology is somehow countered to the extent it no longer exists, and we don't have the manpower anymore, we're going to look a bit stupid, aren't we?
I think you always need to build in, as you think about embracing modern technology, what your resilience is going to be in all of this and what your reversionary techniques are. And we see that when you're teaching somebody to read a map. There's a real risk at the moment, and I'm sure you've seen that with your children, that they'll follow the GPS and discover that they're in the wrong village because they haven't looked at the map as well. So the whole business of reversionary effort is something that we will definitely put into the force structure. But I think you would agree that it would be wrong for us not to consider the opportunities that will come with some of these technologies that might save on some of the functions that are not frontline functions.
Yeah, no, I understand that, General. But you're not in a position to really say that the numbers in the Army now are the minimum to which you are prepared to go. What you're saying is that the future may dictate, possibly, that number may have to change downwards from what you're saying, due to men and women being replaced by technology.
Well, again, but it comes back to what the government wants the Army and the armed forces, for that matter, to do, and that is how we cut our cloth. I think that in this conversation...
Well, no, sorry, General, let me interrupt. If the technology dictates you need the equipment to meet a modern battlefield, that's not up to a politician, is it? That's up to you as to what you need to fight that battle.
Yes, but surely you derive it, as the Chair said earlier, from whatever the foreign and security policy of the government is. That will then give us a determination as to what size of armed forces they need to be able to meet that commitment. But the point I think I would really like to hammer home is that we tend to measure our capability through some metrics that are about platform numbers or the numbers of human beings. And in doing that, we don't necessarily get the whole capability that you can get from the way you integrate everything together, and indeed what you draw from the reserve, for example. And I do think that we shouldn't lose account of the fact that the Army particularly has a reserve component now of 30,000 who deliver a phenomenal amount of additional effect. And what I'd rather be talking about is an army of 120,000. And that army is one that embraces all of those who contribute to it. Because actually at readiness, say 2 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever it might be, they deliver capability which can provide the mass that you need for the eventualities that I think we might be up against.
Can I just move on now to the 5G and the threat by the Americans that they will not base their F-35s here, which is linked to the 5G argument. And as you, I'm sure, have read and heard, it seems that the government is moving away from Huawei installing our 5G. Have you had any assurance from US friends that they will be installing or moving their F-35s here, if indeed, let's say for sake of argument, Huawei does install 5G?
My American opposite number I haven't had the specific conversation with him, but he certainly hasn't warned me of this coming our way, no.
So why have we heard the Americans say that, or the American president certainly saying that that would be the case?
I'm talking about, I can only comment on my military opposite number. It's not my place to judge what the politicians are saying.
And very wise.
Do you have a view on,
indeed.
do you have a view on 5G? Do you have a view on 5G yourself, so far as our security is concerned?
I have a view on the fact that the technology is very useful. Indeed, we are already experimenting with that sort of technology on the battlefield. I hasten to add, not for that particular supplier, but in terms of how you would provide some Wi-Fi connection to make a headquarters work in the field is a very successful and thoughtful way of thinking about it.
Yeah, but it's the supplier I'm asking about.
Yeah, and I've said that we do not use that supplier in any of our sensitive networks.
You use them in any of your networks?
None of our sensitive networks.
No, that wasn't the question. Do you use them in any of your networks?
None of our sensitive networks, none that matter, have Huawei technology.
Yeah, but this comes down to the argument, if I may say, with respect, General, that we've had several times on this committee as to whether, in the evolution of this technology, there is that separation and differentiation between sensitive, secure, core, whatever words one uses, and the rest of the network. That's been a crucial issue in this debate.
Absolutely. And from our military perspective, there is a distinct separation between their provision of technology and the stuff that we use.
I'm just concerned about our vulnerability as we advance and take advantage of the telecoms capabilities in guiding our missiles, in communicating on the battlefield itself, and how easy it would be then to disrupt that in some form or fashion. The ultimate high ground, would you agree, is now moved into space itself. Without the satellites allowing us to communicate, our ability to fight and defend is completely impeded on the ground beneath. What are we doing to advance, protect ourselves in this domain, bearing in mind, going back to China, the massive investments they're putting in, $10 billion a year. They've now landed a rocket on the far side of the moon. They are actually putting more rockets into the space than any other nation in the world now. Are we not concerned that we are becoming more vulnerable in this digital domain?
The answer is that we have now created space as one of our operational domains alongside cyber, land, air and maritime. And we've done that for good reason, which you allude to, and that is that it is a domain that you need to dominate if you're going to be able to operate and fight on a modern battlefield. Now, the challenge, of course, is how you do that. And we are taking the early steps to work out what it means for it to be an operational domain. And first and foremost, it's important to get yourself some form of space situational awareness. It's also going to be important to work out what the redundancy will be that you build into it, because you can't have all of your eggs in one basket. And there's a big challenge if all of your missile guidance systems are going to be powered by GPS, which is hanging above you, because others will find a way of outmanoeuvring that. So the trick is to get the right balance between the different domains. And it may well be that the land domain provides one with some of the alternatives in the future. When one gets into sort of some of the modern technologies and things like atomic clocks, it may be that you can have some redundancy in relation to space. So we're working our way through this at the moment, and it will be an important part of the conversation we have in the integrated review to make sure that we get the right balance of investment to take space forwards.
Okay, I want to pursue a little bit more about what the military is actually doing itself. 13 signals management, for example. John, do you want to take us forward on this one?
Yeah.
Was it? Okay, Kevin, go ahead.
Well, no, I just want to come back to I was the question before, but I think, was it Richard ate that sandwich early on, but can I ask a question in terms of relation to Huawei?
Okay, very quickly. I then want to move on to about 13 signals.
You seem to be dominating the bloody questions again, Chairman.
Well, we've only got half an hour left, and we've got two big chunky themes to
if you didn't go off
to
piece, it might help. But in terms, can I just get this clarified, General? Because we've heard a lot of nonsense, frankly, from a lot of commentators about the vulnerability of our network if we have Huawei in it. Can you just repeat the point? Is that none of our secure networks, because we heard from a senator from Arkansas a few weeks ago that somehow having Huawei in any of our equipment in the telecom network would make our secure systems vulnerable. That is not the case, is it?
No.
Thank you.
Signal regiment.
Kevin.
You can answer that.
Right.
Chairman seems to make noise as it goes along.
What will be the 13th Signals Regiment role be?
So it's described as a CEMA regiment, which stands for Cyber and Electronic Magnetic Activity. And the answer is that it will probably combine cyber and electronic warfare in terms of its capability. And as you know, the Army has for a long time had an electronic warfare regiment. This is the first time it's gone for a SEMA regiment, as we're now describing it. It will certainly be carefully integrated into what we're doing with the National Security Cyber Centre. It'll be certainly closely integrated into what we do with the National Cyber Force and all of that. And I would see it being very much a growth area for the development of the sort of skills that we'll need to have the higher levels of cyber capability. And one of the things that's very interesting in terms of the way Defence is looking at the cyber space at the moment is how we are developing that career structure. Because what we are learning from this, of course, is it's a career structure that can't be run by each of the single services themselves. It's one that needs to be run in a unified fashion. Because by doing that, there's a reasonable chance that you will maximise the talent, but you'll also be able to provide the sort of skill sets that you need to be able to do this properly. So we see this as an exciting opportunity to begin to build our cyber capability even more than where it is at the moment. And it'll be an opportunity, I think, to really embrace the information environment. Now, it'll be part of our 6th Division, and our 6th Division in the Army is the one that deals with information manoeuvre. So it also has 77 Brigade, which you'll have heard of, I think, which deals with...
You've been down there.
Indeed. So it'll be alongside that and the other capabilities we've got in that division. And the purpose of it, of course, is to give us information dominance, which is something that on the modern battlefield becomes ever more important.
So presumably it will have a substantial reserve component in it as well, will it?
There will be, in terms of the career structure, there will be a significant reserve component.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Good. If we can now turn to the culture of the armed forces itself. Sarah, do you want to take us forward on this one?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, General. During your introduction, you touched on your greatest asset being your people. The Secretary of State for Defence wants a more diverse armed forces, and indeed last month it's reported as saying the department hadn't done well enough. Now, female and BAME personnel are overrepresented in the military complaints system and underrepresented in recruitment. So, General, are your diversity and inclusiveness initiatives failing?
They're not doing well enough. I think I would absolutely concur. And indeed, this morning we got together as a chiefly body. So that's the 3 single service chiefs, myself, the commander of UK Strategic Command, and also the vice chief. And we had a very first principle conversation about how we can increase our effort and deliver some action that will actually take us over the bar. Now, the thing that I think is really worrying, particularly, is the culture. I do think that despite a number of surveys, despite a number of efforts, not least stuff that I did when I was head of the Army in relation to leadership and all of that, we still stubbornly have a culture that doesn't recognise that diversity and inclusion need to be at the heart of teamwork. And teamwork, of course, is what makes the armed forces function as effective as they should do. So we are in no doubt that we have to change that. And that means that we've got to get after this, I put it in parentheses, laddish culture, which doesn't recognise that actually you've got to be properly doing stuff rather than having a sort of slightly apathetic view to it. And that has to change. What we also have to change, I think, is we have to recognise that role models are going to be very important in this equation. And it's simply unacceptable that in the top 150 or so of general officers across the 3 services, we only have 3 women. And that doesn't provide enough role models. And that means that we are going to have to think really hard about positive action. We have a career structure that is still designed predominantly for men. And the reality is that when you get to a certain point in your life and you perhaps want to create a family, you are massively disadvantaged if you take time out. And that doesn't matter whether you're a mother or a father. The reality is that we have to change the career structure so that those with genuine long-term potential are able to satisfy their family needs as well as going on to realise their military potential. And we are going to put in place a number of initiatives that will change that. What we're also going to do is to put in place some initiatives that will get after the leadership culture, because the way in which we currently report on people, their annual assessment, I don't think provides nearly enough emphasis on the sorts of behaviours that we want to encourage. Too much of the time it's about people being upwardly looking leaders and not being downwardly looking leaders. And what I'm looking for are people being judged on their moral courage and their ability to look after the people that they have the privilege to command and to lead. And if they do that, I think we've got a much better chance of stamping out the laddish and often much worse than that, thoroughly unacceptable behaviour that means that we undoubtedly push some of the really talented female but also black, Asian and minority ethnic people that we have in the armed forces out after only a few years. It is simply unacceptable that we are not moving the dial on this thing. And what will happen as a consequence of this session we had this morning is that the 6 chiefs of staff will sign a piece of paper which will make some really tough commitments to changing things. And we will then hold ourselves to account, and those we lead will hold us to account for delivering against those commitments.
Can I ask you then, General, what progress have you made on the implementation of the Wigston report into inappropriate behaviour in the military? They made 38 recommendations.
I would say that about half of them have gone in the right direction, and about half of them need greater work. One of the things that has got to be improved is the service complaints system. It is simply unacceptable at the moment that this complaints system is, first of all, far too slow to deliver an outcome, and secondly, by the time it does deliver an outcome, it's often irrelevant in terms of the censure that comes with that outcome. But importantly, it's also very challenging for people to have the moral courage and the bravery to make a complaint, because invariably the complaint has to be made to the chain of command. Now, whilst it is a very positive initiative that we have a service complaints ombudswoman in Nicola Williams, the reality is that we need to review the service complaint system so that it becomes genuinely agile, it genuinely comes with censure, which happens in a relevant time frame, and importantly, it's a complaint system that makes it possible for people to have the bravery to make the complaint they need to make. And that's something that we have to change, and it is one of the commitments that this document I referred to a moment ago will have in it. So I think that's the most important thing in Wigston. But to your point, Danuta Gray, who is our Defence Board non-executive who faces off on all our HR issues, has taken on a review of the Wigston report to see where we have got to with it. What she will also look at, and I have great confidence in her to do this, is whether Wigston went far enough. Because I bet you Wigston didn't go far enough, because it was done in 6 weeks. It was done with a lot of momentum. It was a very, very good report, but I bet you it could probably go a bit further, and she will look at that as well. So the answer is you have my personal commitment and that of my fellow chiefs of staff to make a difference. And I genuinely believe that we've got a body of people who realise that this is something that is a no-mission failure mission.
General, you mentioned a document and a review. Have you got any timelines for this?
Yeah, Danuta will do this very quickly, she told me this morning. I'd be amazed if we don't have it by the beginning of the autumn term.
Thank you, General.
Emma, did you want to come in on this one?
Yes, Chair, just briefly, thanks. Good afternoon, General. Just in relation to your comments made about the bravery and the moral courage to come forward and make a complaint, I want to just take that into the bracket of those children who are in the armed forces, the 15 to 18-year-olds, because I can't find any stats or any figures that relate to the complaints made from that age bracket. Do they exist, and do you have any information you can share with us?
Sorry, can you just repeat the age bracket?
15 to 18.
Right. The answer is I don't have the data in front of me, but I will happily write to you afterwards with the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Just on that, something we were talking about with some of the colleagues earlier, one of the success stories that you have here in the UK is your cadet programs. Right across the country, these are being pushed out. And if you look at the statistics there, male, female, BAME and so forth, they're absolutely fantastic. I mean, they're much, much, much better. Clearly, there's always want to move forward on that. It is a difficult area to move from and encourage those in cadets to then consider a career in the armed forces because of all the wider issues to do with child recruitment and so forth. We craft a very, very careful approach to this with 16-year-olds able to wear the uniform but not go to battle. Is there more that could be done to take advantage of those people that clearly have signed up to something, an ethos, an idea and an interest which perhaps could be leveraged as a potential career?
General, just before you answer, if you can take, say, my constituency, the incredible diversity in the cadets should provide an area where you could achieve some of your other objectives that we were just discussing earlier.
No, and it's a very good question. I mean, as Marc Francois knows better than most, I mean, the reality of the cadet movement is that we have to be very careful not to describe it as a recruiting enterprise. And indeed, the vital adult cadet instructors who do that, some of them are ex-military, but a lot of them aren't at all. And they certainly wouldn't do their job if they were being regarded as recruiters. So we have to, it's a very delicate balance. I think the reality is that we do gain a lot of recruits from the cadet movement. But it's not a statistic that we track particularly carefully, not least because often cadets don't want to acknowledge that they've been cadets when they join the military, which is a challenge in its own right. But interestingly, those that do acknowledge that they've been cadets, often if you track their progress, you discover that they do attain very high ranks because they are motivated in that particular way. So it's a nuanced and delicate thing, but I think the important thing is that we keep doing it. And I think it's very important that we have also rolled out the scheme now into schools. So the combined cadet force, rather than just the adult cadet force, is now a burgeoning enterprise. And I went and inspected a school the autumn before last in southeast London. And I was massively impressed by the diversity and enthusiasm of the kids who were in that organisation.
Isn't the gatekeepers you need to get to the parents in those communities? Because often there's an enthusiasm amongst young people, but the gatekeepers, the parents and guardians, they're the ones that you actually have to work on as much as the children, the young people themselves.
Yes, and actually it's also the head teachers. I mean, the school I went to, Mosselman's, the head teacher was massively committed to the idea. Yeah. And where you've got a partnership with a head teacher, in the you crack it, but then he will then get the parents on, he or she rather, will then get the parents on board. So it's a sort of triangular relationship, and if you make it work, my goodness me, it's really impressive and rather inspiring to see what they all get up to. So the other angle slightly to the question was junior soldiers or junior leaders, and again one has to be slightly careful with how that plays into this conversation, because that's when you get into potential suggestions of child soldiers and all of this stuff.
Mark, did you want to...
Just quickly, CDS, to entirely agree with your point. I mean, I visited Westcliff High School for Boys some years ago, where they started a cadet movement, I think with a dozen cadets. They very kindly asked me to go to their passing out parade last summer. There's 130 of them. So the government had a programme to spread cadet units, particularly CCFs, into state schools. And I think there was a target of 500 schools. Yeah. And as I understand it, you've either met it or you're very close. Is there any, because that's been so successful, is there any prospect that there'll be a sort of second batch or an attempt to go beyond that? And if there isn't, are you still welcoming the establishment of new individual cadet units in schools that want to do it, even on a case-by-case basis?
I mean, the straight answer to the last part of the question is yes.
Good.
And I don't know whether there is a government initiative to go beyond 500. I mean, as you'll remember, the original initiative was a combined effort between the Department for Education and the Ministry of Defence.
Indeed.
But I would be amazed if the current Education Secretary didn't think it was a good idea to take it further. So maybe something that we should all ask about, because I agree with you. I think it's an extraordinarily good way of developing the right sort of attitudes in society and providing outlets and opportunities for youngsters who wouldn't otherwise get them.
Very quickly, I think the magic formula, you're quite right, it's an enthusiastic head who's, if you like, on side. The second thing I think is having a young teacher who doesn't have to have military experience but wants to be the contingent commander, and then finding a retired senior NCO who actually spends a lot of time training the cadets. It's that magic troika that really seems to make it work. We're following on from Mr. Jones and Mr. Speller's point. It's a brilliant way of giving people, perhaps from backgrounds who don't have a great deal of military experience, some insight into the military ethos. So, again, I suspect we would all encourage anything that you can do to encourage the DFE to do to expand the programme.
Let us ask, presumed the cadet programmes have had to be curtailed because of COVID-19 and schools and things like that. Do you know if they will get back up and running in September? Are you aware?
Actually, there's been some really imaginative stuff done remotely with a lot of the cadet movement in the same way we're doing this particular session. So the answer is they've kept it ticking over in a pretty effective way. And we rather hope, in the same way that we are returning to physical activity again, that the cadet movement will also be able to do that, provided that the troika that Marc-François refers to are able to make that happen.
Let's ask one last one. Just, you mentioned that you've learned a lot about the NHS by virtue of working with them, and I do acknowledge what DE&S have done in terms of COVID. We have reserves. The police have reserves. They have the special constabulary. The NHS have called up many people to return to the front line from retirement to help out, and they've done a brilliant job. Do you think there's any merit? I know it's not your department, but you do know about reservists and integrating them in with the regulars. Do you think there's any merit in the NHS trying to establish some kind of NHS reserve so that maybe people... Yeah, no, but I mean, they're doing it ad hoc now, but I'm talking about institutionalising that, Kevin, so that maybe people who've worked full-time could work part-time as a reservist to assist the service. I ask the question because you know a lot about reservists.
Yeah, I think you know, when we all stand back and reflect on what we've learned from COVID,
yeah.
I think we will ask ourselves, won't we, whether we need to build more resilience into lots of parts of the country and the government in particular. And I think one of the questions that we reasonably might ask is, do we want to have surge capacity in our health system? And surge capacity would definitely come from either rapid military reinforcement, which of course we've done, but equally it could come from civil society. So I think it's something we should definitely reflect on.
Thank you, Jim.
Would you support the idea of, given the massive hike in unemployment that we're possibly going to experience, a return of some form of national service? I think one has to be very careful with this as an idea because, of course, it markedly changes the way in which your full-time regular service has to operate. And, of course, you need to give them work. You know, when we had national service, of course, we had the remnants of an empire and there were places to be policed. And, of course, that's not the case any longer. So I would be a bit challenged with what work you'd give them and how you'd keep them occupied if you did do it. Okay, interesting. Can we move to Gavin Robinson? Do you want to take us to the historic allegations issue? Gavin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, General, for what's been a very wide-ranging and useful exchange so far. Could I turn your mind to the Overseas Operations Bill and maybe inquire in the first instance what your involvement was in the proposals that have been brought forward and how comfortable you are that whilst it may stop prosecutions, it will not stop investigations?
No, thank you for the question. I mean, the answer is that the Chiefs of Staff have been consulted on some of the propositions. And, of course, we've all learned with the evolving character of warfare that the way in which lawfare, I put it in parentheses, has become a feature of the modern battlefield. And that, of course, is something that as military officers we're deeply uncomfortable about, because anything that removes the opportunity and the motivation for leaders at every level, but particularly junior leaders, to take the sorts of risks that you need to take on modern battlefields to seize those fleeting opportunities is something that we would not want to see undermined. So we welcome this initiative as, I hope, a first step in trying to provide a better legal, moral and ethical framework in which we can operate on overseas battlefields. And whilst I haven't personally taken soundings of what people in the armed forces think about this, the chain of command has certainly reported back that people are encouraged by the focus on it in the way that it has been applied.
Okay, can I just ask, I don't want to know the legal requirements for doing so. I don't think it's fair to ask you to outline those, or indeed the political rationale behind separating out overseas operations and what we understand will be a subsequent measure which will attach to the Northern Ireland specific incidents that are currently being investigated and many more potentially to follow. But can I ask you, as CDS, are you assured that the protections that are outlined in the Overseas Operations Bill will be as protective and as impactful and as effective as what's outlined in this bill for Northern Ireland?
The straight answer is I don't know. I mean, obviously, as a military officer, my view would be that I hope so, but the answer is I don't know, because it remains, as you alluded to, a political issue at the moment.
Emma, it's something as CDS you would want to ensure.
Certainly, I would want to give input to the outcome of it, and I would very much hope that my views would be listened to during the course of that discussion.
Could I draw upon the Judge Advocate General's reported concerns about the Overseas Operations Bill in that it does not cover international criminal court offences, and his concern that it will likely encourage police and prosecutors to focus on war crimes rather than what may otherwise be considered domestic crimes. Are you aware of the Judge Advocate General's concerns, and do you have a response to them?
I wasn't aware of those concerns specifically, but one of the points I should have made, I think, in answer to your previous question, was, of course, as the head of the armed forces, I still firmly believe that it's right and proper that we are held to account for any immoral or illegal behaviour on a battlefield, because if we lose that moral high ground, then we're in a really bad place.
Okay. And are you aware of any decisions taken further down the chain of command to reflect the structures of the Overseas Operations Bill in any proposals for training and doctrine?
The answer is that we will evaluate the bill and what it means for our doctrine and make sure that we issue the appropriate guidance, as we did post the Iraq War, when, of course, we were worried about how we did prisoner handling and things like that.
Will that be publicly available, do you believe, having made your assessment, or will that remain an internal?
I think that the doctrine will very likely be an internal document, but that doesn't mean that some of it can't be briefed to the committee if you'd like to see it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Evan, thank you. Emma, and I think Mark Francois wanted to come in here as well. Emma. And Richard.
Thanks again, Chair. Hello again, General. I just wondered if you're aware of the criticisms that exist around the long stop, in particular in relation to PTSD, which you will know will take a long time to manifest and for the symptoms to show themselves. The criticism has been that the MOD is putting service personnel in a worse position than civilians, and that's actually backdoor legislation which is in direct breach of the Armed Forces Covenant. So my question to you, General, is, are you aware of this criticism? And if so, what comments do you have to make of that?
So is this specifically in relation to the Overseas Operations Bill?
Yes, it's in relation to the 6-limit long stop on veterans and serving personnel bringing civil claims for personal injury or death, and in relation in particular to any of those claims that might relate to PTSD or conditions that do not manifest immediately within that long stop period.
Now, my understanding is that the clock starts from the point of diagnosis.
So that's the point of knowledge?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll leave it there for a moment.
Okay, I'm going to come back if you want to. Mark.
Yeah.
General, as my colleague Gavin Robinson has said, we're dealing with two bills. The overseas one first, so Iraq, Afghanistan and future conflicts, and then the second one to follow on Northern Ireland. On the day the first bill had its first reading and was published, there was some criticism that this didn't solve the Northern Ireland issues. So the Northern Ireland Secretary that day issued a written ministerial statement assuring the House that Northern Ireland veterans would receive, I believe the phrase was, equivalent protection, or words to that effect. And that was a guarantee from the Northern Ireland office, as it were, in the second bill. As the Chief of the Defence Staff, do you welcome that commitment from the NIO?
I welcome any commitment as a military officer that looks after our veterans.
Thank you. And are you concerned that if these issues aren't addressed, which the Prime Minister has promised that he will do, he was very clear about that when he ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party, he famously signed a double-page pledge in the Sun to that effect. Is there a risk that if these issues for any reason were not to be addressed, that over time it could affect recruitment into the armed forces, because basically people will think, why join if the politicians haven't got your back?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the other side of the coin I mentioned about seizing opportunities on battlefields. You know, that there needs to be, I think, for the military instrument to be an effective instrument, confidence in a government that it's going to look after those people when they put their lives at risk in pursuit of those government's objectives.
But as the CDS, are you reassured that the Prime Minister has personally given his word that he will address this problem?
Absolutely, I'm reassured, yes.
Thank you.
Here's to many people.
Richard Drax, did you have a question?
Yes, if I may just come back, and forgive me, leave Northern Ireland for a second, General, and just go back to the percentage of GDP that we're committed to spending. At the start of your interview this afternoon, you, and I've written down here, you said you were satisfied with what we have. That was an answer to a question to what resources you had. I was a little surprised by that because when you and I were both in our 20s, the government was spending about 5.5% of GDP on kit that didn't cost nearly as much as it does today. And as you've heard, we're still dealing with weapon systems that are outdated in effect. Are you really satisfied that 2% is sufficient, or can you tell us that, or can you give us a figure that ideally you would like to have to ensure that you could provide our armed forces with all the kit that they probably need?
I mean, the answer to your question is that governments tailor their defence spending to what it is they require of their armed forces. And if the government changes its ambition for what it wants of its armed forces, then I would imagine that the amount of money it spends on it will change as well. I am reassured that there is this baseline of 2% of GDP, and I'm equally reassured that there is this manifesto commitment to defence expenditure rising by 0.5% in real terms every year. Now, we are having an integrated review at the moment, and that integrated review will come to a determination about what it wants our foreign security and defence policy to be, and on the back of that, I'm absolutely confident that our resources will be cut or will be delivered accordingly.
Now, I understand you had an away day quite recently with the Secretary of State with no Treasury figures. That must have been a relief for you all, I suspect. Have you got to the point where what you all want can be laid down beside what we can afford, or is that to come?
No, that is part of work in progress.
And just to go back to the point, I mean, you say this depends on the government and what the government wants, so far as defence is concerned. I mean, can I just take you back to where we were, General, when we were young men? 5% on defence. It's now 2%. A lot of our accommodation is still not up to scratch, I'm sure you would agree. And the accommodation for our men and women is still not good enough, so many reports tell us. Now, if we can't afford the accommodation, how on earth can we afford to look after and equip our modern armed services?
Well, I think if you cast your mind back, as you keep doing, to when you and I were young subalterns together, you'll recall that the size of the British Army then was around 155,000. You'll also recall that it had over 3,000 main battle tanks. You will also recall that it had a massive air force and a massive navy, and that it was up against a very clear and present threat. And for all of those reasons, it was entirely logical that we spent 5% of GDP. What you'll also remember, I suspect, was that when Active Edge, that exercise that mobilised us into our deployment areas, was called, rarely did more than 2 out of 3 tanks ever find their way to where they needed to get to. So I think there are problems with the analogy of what we did in the past. What it comes down to is what they expect of us today. And as I said in answer to this question once and maybe twice before, what general, what chief of staff for that matter, wouldn't ask for more money? Of course we would do. And that's our job, is to ask for more money. But equally, I am the agent of the government and I deal with what I am given. And I provide military advice to the government based upon what they give me and therefore what I think they should be asking us to do.
We were up against a clear threat then. I'm not harping back to the past, General, don't get me wrong. But we are up against a threat now. You've admitted yourself, although you don't say the Chinese are a threat, but certainly you indicate that they could well be, and the Russians are. So things haven't changed that much. And the kit we now need to buy, aircraft carriers, F-35s, they're hugely more expensive than they were in our day. That's the comparison I'm making, not necessarily with the situation per se.
Yes, I think the threat is different, because I think when you look back to the days of the Cold War, you wouldn't find it difficult to persuade the general public that there was a clear and present threat from the Soviet Union. I think it is much harder nowadays to describe the threat, given the evolving character of warfare which you yourself referred to, given the fact that that threat manifests itself in the information domain, in the cyber domain, and in wars that people simply don't see under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. It's much harder now for us to explain the threat. And I'm certain if you went round your constituents, it would be very challenging to get them beyond terrorism as being the real threat to this country at the moment. And the challenge we all have, and everybody on this committee is in the same place as me because you love defence and you love the armed forces, is we have to make the case that the threat represents a challenge that we can't avoid. And that case has to be made to the general public who pay our taxes. And I've often said in the past that the extraordinary thing about the armed forces these days is that it's difficult to remember a time when they were more popular. You know, a 90% approval rating last year. But it's also very difficult to remember a time, I would have thought, when we were less well understood. And trying to explain what we do has been an opportunity from COVID, but gosh, we need to carry on explaining it, because it's only by doing that that you can bring this to life, and you can then genuinely bring on, you know, a view in the general public that there is a threat that needs to be dealt with.
On that point,
that was a good note to finish on.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, do you think defence is reported as an issue in the kind of detail that it was reported on perhaps 10 or 20 years ago?
No, I don't. And I don't think there's the same academic debate that there would have been on things like nuclear deterrence and those sorts of things. It's just not I don't think it's a subject that is, you know, people are particularly interested in. Now, we have opportunities, and I hope you're all going to be doing something for VJ Day on the 15th of August, because there are opportunities through some of the commemorative activity to bring this stuff to life. Yep. But we do need to bring it to life, would be my judgment as the head of the armed forces.
And that is the conundrum that we face, is you said government sets out its ambition, but then it needs to come up with the spending to allow you to achieve that ambition. And that's the difference. That's going back to the STSR 2015. That was the challenge with that. So getting this right, making sure that we set out the next integrated review, but it comes with the actual the money from the Treasury to fulfill that. Otherwise, we'll end up repeating the mistakes that we did back in 2015. I just want to end on a note to give tribute to our veterans, because I hope you'd agree with me that during COVID-19, many of those charities that are able to collect funds on a normal basis have not been able to do so. And would you agree that there is a concern that the support, particularly in mental health areas, perhaps has been impinged because of the inability for those charities to do their work? And it is something for all of us collectively to look at, to see what we can do to compensate, because they are not getting the attention and support that they need, partly because of the lockdown initially, but also simply because the funding through our fantastic veterans charities has been hugely impacted.
Yes, I would absolutely agree.
General, thank you very much indeed. There's been a wide-ranging discussion, much to be talked about. I think as Mark implied, we ask the difficult questions not because we're not on side, we absolutely are, but simply because we want our best for those who have served and who are serving, and those intend to serve as well. So thank you very much indeed for coming to the committee today, and thank you for the committee members as well. Order, order.
Thank you.
The proceeding